Mabel Hart pressed her last coin into the merchant's hand and walked out with nothing. Not flour, not salt, not even the dignity of being refused quietly because Roy Finch had laughed loud enough for the whole street to hear and said a woman her size ought to pay double just for the shadow she cast. She didn't cry. She was past crying. But that night, a man knocked on her door in the dark, rain-soaked trail worn, holding a small boy against his chest. And everything Mabel Hart believed about her own worth began to change. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Mabel's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The coin had been her last one. Mabel Hart knew it the moment she pressed it into Roy Finch's palm and watched his fat fingers close around it like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. She'd counted that coin 4 times that morning sitting at her kitchen table before the sun was fully up, hoping somehow the number would change. It didn't. 1 coin. Enough for a small sack of flour and maybe a paper of salt if Roy was feeling generous. Roy Finch was never feeling generous. He took the coin, looked at it, looked at her, and then looked back at the 3 women standing near the pickle barrel like they were an audience he'd been waiting for all morning. "That'll cover the flour," he said. "Barely." Mabel said, "Then I'll take the flour, Mr. Finch." She kept her voice level. She was good at that. She'd had years of practice keeping her voice level while her face went hot and her hands went cold, and something deep in her chest pulled tight like a cinch strap being drawn too hard. Roy didn't move to get the flour. He just stood there behind his counter with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders and that particular smile on his face, the one that meant he wasn't done yet. "You know," he said conversationally loud enough to carry, "I had a draft horse once that ate near about what you must. Fine animal. Worked hard though, earned its keep." The 3 women by the pickle barrel tittered. One of them, Clara Hendricks, who had not said a kind word to Mabel since the funeral, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, like the laughter was something she was trying to contain. Mabel looked at Roy Finch. She looked at him for a long, still moment, long enough that his smile flickered just slightly at the edges. Then she said, "The flour, please." He got it. He dropped it on the counter harder than he needed to. Mabel picked it up, tucked it under her arm, and walked out into the summer heat without another word. The sun hit her like a fist. Dry Creek in July was not a forgiving place. The dust was fine and pale, and it got into everything: your hair, your teeth, the cracks in your hands, and the heat came down from the mountains in waves that made the far end of Main Street ripple like water. Mabel walked with her head up and her eyes forward, and the sack of flour pressed against her side, and she did not look at the man sitting in front of the barber shop who called out something she made herself not hear. She was halfway home when she stopped. She stopped because she had just remembered that the flour was the last of it. That there was no lard in the house, no eggs, 3 potatoes going soft in the cellar, and a smokehouse that had been empty since April. That the rent on her father's cabin. Her cabin now, which was the only thing left of him. Besides debt, was due at the end of the month. That the end of the month was 11 days away. That she had no coin left and no work lined up and no family to ask. She stood in the middle of the road in the full July sun, and she added it all up. The way she always added it up. The way she had been adding it up since the morning they put her father in the ground, and Silas Crow had appeared at her door, hat in hand, and legal paper in the other, with a smile, like a man who had been waiting patiently for something to die. The numbers didn't improve. They never improved. Mabel walked the rest of the way home. The cabin sat at the edge of town proper, past the livery and the Widow Marsh's vegetable garden, where the road turned to dirt track, and the cottonwood trees grew along the dry creek bed. It was a small cabin, not much to look at, but her father had built the kitchen solid, and the roof had been patched well enough that it only leaked in 2 spots when it rained hard. There was a front porch, a small garden plot that Mabel had been working every morning before the heat came on, and a wood fence that needed mending along the east side. She let herself in, put the flour away, and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she pulled on her apron, built a small fire, even in the heat, and started making something from the 3 soft potatoes and what remained of the salt she'd rationed down to the last pinches. Cooking steadied her. Always had. There was something about the precision of it, about knowing that if you did the thing right, the result would be what it was supposed to be, that calmed the part of her mind that spent most of its time cataloging everything that could go wrong. She ate at the table as the light went gold, and the heat finally began to ease off. Then she washed her bowl, banked the fire, and went to bed. She was not asleep when the knock came. She wasn't sure what time it was late, full dark, the kind of darkness that meant the moon had already set. She'd been lying in the heat, listening to the nightjars and going over the numbers again, not because she expected them to change, but because her mind wouldn't leave them alone. The knock startled her upright. It was not a loud knock. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men who came to doors in the middle of the night knocked like they owned the door. This knock was careful, like whoever was on the other side was trying to be heard without waking anyone who didn't need to be woken. Mabel got up. She pulled her shawl over her nightgown, picked up the short iron poker from beside the cold hearth, and went to the door. "Who's there?" A pause. Then a voice low and roughened from what sounded like hours of hard riding. "Name's Elias Walker. I got a boy with me who hasn't eaten today. I'm not asking for much, ma'am. Just if you've got anything at all." Mabel stood with her hand on the bolt. Men lied. She knew that. She'd learned that with considerable thoroughness over the past 18 months. But she had also been the person on the other side of a closed door more than once in her life. The person standing in the dark, hoping somebody would open it, and she had never quite been able to forget what that felt like. She opened the door. The man on her porch was tall, mountain, tall. The kind of build that came from actual labor rather than the showing-off kind. Dark hair plastered to his forehead from rain. She could see now that it had rained up in the hills, though not a drop had reached Dry Creek. His shirt was soaked through. There was a scar that ran across his left eyebrow, pale against sun-browned skin. His eyes in the light from her lamp were the particular color of creek water, under shade gray with something green in it. How was holding a boy against his chest. The boy was asleep, or close to it, his head tucked under the man's chin, one small fist knotted in the front of his father's wet shirt. He looked maybe 6 years old, maybe 7. He was thin in the way that meant he hadn't been eating enough for a while, not just today, and his face, even in sleep, had a pinched quality that Mabel recognized. She'd worn that face herself at that age. "Come in," she said. "The man." Elias Walker looked at her. Just for a moment, like he hadn't quite expected that, or maybe like he was checking whether she meant it. Then he stepped inside, ducking his head slightly under the doorframe, and stood in her kitchen. "I'll pay you," he said. "I don't have coin tonight, but I'll pay you." "Sit down," Mabel said. She was already moving. She poked the fire back to life and set the skillet on, and she thought about her 3 soft potatoes and her rationed salt, and then she did not think about them because there was a hungry child in her kitchen. She cut the potatoes thin, fried them in what was left of her lard, found the heel of a cornbread she'd forgotten was wrapped in cloth on the high shelf and sliced it. She put water on to heat. The boy woke while she was cooking. He sat up in his father's arms, looked at Mabel with large dark eyes, and said nothing at all. "His name is Samuel," Elias said. "Hello, Samuel," Mabel said, not looking up from the skillet. The boy looked at his father. Elias gave a small nod. Samuel said very quietly, "Hello, ma'am." "You like fried potatoes?" A pause. Then, "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She slid the first portion onto the tin plate she used for company. "Eat slow. You'll make yourself sick if you don't." She set the plate in front of the boy. She watched him eat, watched him try to eat slow, the way she'd told him to, watched him struggle with it, and mostly succeed. And she felt something tighten in her throat that she swallowed back down. Elias Walker did not eat until Samuel had finished his plate and half of another. Only then did he accept the tin cup of coffee Mabel offered and the small plate she put in front of him, and he ate with the same careful restraint as his son, like a man who had long since learned not to take more than was offered. "You came down out of the mountains," Mabel said. It wasn't a question. She could smell it on him, pine sap. Wood smoke, the particular cold water scent of high-altitude streams, all of it layered under road dust. "From the Walker Range," he said. "My ranch." "There's a Walker Ranch up in the mountains." She'd heard of it, vaguely. One of the old claims up past the tree line where the summer pasture ran long. She'd heard it was abandoned. "Was abandoned," he said, reading her somehow. "I'm trying to put it right." Samuel had fallen back asleep against the table. One cheek resting on his folded arms, the empty plate pushed aside. Elias reached over and adjusted the boy's position so his neck wasn't bent awkward. I know who you are, Elias said then, quietly, looking at his coffee. Mabel Hart. I've ridden through Dry Creek before. I know what they say about you. Mabel's hands stilled on the dishcloth. I'm not interested in what they say, she said. No, he said. I didn't think you were. He looked up. I'm telling you I know it because I want you to know it didn't change what I knocked on your door. Something about the directness of that was almost physically startling. People in Dry Creek did not speak directly. They came at things sideways and wrapped their meanings in 12 other words, and smiled while they said the cruelest parts. Elias Walker looked at her across her own kitchen table, and spoke like a man who had too little energy left for anything but the plain truth. Mabel didn't know what to do with it, so she folded the dishcloth over the edge of the basin and said, You can sleep in the barn. I've got a pallet and a horse blanket. The porch is fine, he said. There's dry hay in the barn, and it's cooler. I don't keep animals right now, so it's clean. He looked at her for a moment. Then, Obliged, ma'am. Don't call me ma'am, she said. I'm 27 years old. For the first time barely just at the corners, Elias Walker's mouth moved in something that was almost not a frown. It wasn't a smile, not exactly. But it was something. Obliged, he said again. How was there in the morning? Mabel had half expected, half told herself, that she would wake up and the barn would be empty, and there would be nothing left of the night but her emptied lard tin and the 2 plates to wash. She had given shelter to a stranger and a child, and fed them from her last provisions, and she was prepared to have nothing to show for it. She was acquainted with that particular arithmetic. But Elias Walker was in her yard when she came out at dawn, and he had already split half the woodpile she hadn't been able to get through because the axe handle was cracked, and she hadn't had the coin to replace it. Samuel was sitting on the porch steps, eating an apple. She had no idea where the apple had come from, and watching his father work with the calm expression of a boy who was used to watching his father do useful things. Mabel stood at the door of the cabin. The axle on your rain barrels worked loose, Elias said, not stopping, not looking up. I can fix it this morning if you've got a wrench that fits. There's a wrench on the shelf in the barn, she said. Left side hanging on a nail. He nodded. Mabel went back inside and made what there was to make for breakfast, which was cornmeal porridge and the last of the coffee, and she made enough for 3 without asking whether that was what anyone wanted. When she brought it out, Samuel said unprompted, Thank you, Miss Mabel. And something in Mabel's chest did something she hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. Elias sat across from her on the porch steps and ate and didn't try to fill the quiet, which was the first indication she had that he was a man she could perhaps tolerate for more than 5 minutes. The town was starting to move. She could hear the livery, hear the distant roll of a wagon on Main Street, and the morning was still cool, the heat not yet descended, and the cottonwood leaves made their dry sound in the small breeze. I have a proposal, Elias said. Mabel looked at him over her tin cup. My ranch needs work, he said. More work than one man and a boy can do through summer. I need someone who can cook, keep a kitchen, help me understand what's been going wrong with the land management. The grain's been disappearing. I can't account for it, and I need a second pair of eyes. I need someone who's not afraid of hard work and not afraid to speak plain when something's wrong. He looked at her steadily. I've heard enough in this town this morning already to know you're all 3. Mabel set her cup down. You've been in town since this morning. You don't know me. I know you fed a stranger's child from your last provisions without being asked and without making it a production, he said. That tells me more than most people would in a month. She looked out toward the cottonwoods. The town will talk. The town already talks, he said. You told me yourself you're not interested. That almost made her smile too. Almost. What does it pay? She asked. Fair wages, $30 for the summer, plus board at the ranch, your own room, your own provisions. If the ranch is still standing at the end of summer and the water rights are secure, there's a bonus on top, $30. Mabel did the arithmetic without letting it show on her face. $30 was more than double what she owed Silas Crow at the end of the month. It was the difference between keeping her father's cabin and losing it. It was the difference between standing in Roy Finch's store with her last coin and something else, something different from that. The boy comes, she said. Samuel goes where I go. I want it plain between us, she said. I work for wages. I'm not charity, and I'm not company. Elias Walker looked at her. Miss Hart, he said, I don't hire charity. I hire strength. There's a difference. The porch was quiet, except for the cottonwood sound and the far-off noise of the waking town. Samuel had finished his porridge and was watching a beetle make its way across the porch boards with the serious attention of a boy with nothing more pressing to attend to. Mabel picked up her cup, finished her coffee, and stood. I'll need 2 days to arrange the cabin, she said. Who watches it while I'm at your ranch? Widow Marsh next door, he said. I'll ask her myself if you'd rather not. Mabel looked at him sharply. How do you know about Widow Marsh? I spent an hour this morning asking around about you, he said. No apology, no softening, plain. I told you I know what they say. I wanted to know what was true. The directness of it was startling again. She didn't know what to do with it again. She turned and went inside to begin deciding what to pack. She did not know, could not have known that, even as Elias Walker fixed her rain barrel that morning and Samuel sat watching his beetle. Silas Crow was standing in his office on Main Street with a legal paper in one hand and a whiskey glass in the other, looking out his window toward the edge of town where Mabel Hart's cabin sat. His man Denny had already told him about the tall cowboy who'd ridden in last night, had told him the name, and Silas Crow, who had been in Dry Creek for 7 years, building something slow and careful out of other people's misfortune, had set down his glass very carefully and said with a voice as calm as a man who had just heard news he'd been dreading for a long time, Walker. Just that. Just the name. Then he'd picked up the glass again and finished his whiskey and told Denny to keep watching. Mabel, gathering her things into a flour sack and getting ready to go up the mountain with Elias Walker, had tripped a wire somewhere in Silas Crow's careful construction, a wire she didn't know existed in a trap she didn't know had been set, and the machinery of it was already beginning to move. She wouldn't understand what she'd stepped into for another week yet. By then, it would already be too late for Silas Crow to stop it. Mabel had been on the Walker ranch for exactly 4 days when she found the hoof prints. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was looking for the reason 3 pounds of oats had gone missing from the feed shed overnight when the shed door had been latched from the inside and Elias had been sleeping in the barn 20 feet away. She'd woken before dawn the way she always did, built the kitchen fire, put the coffee on, and then walked out to start her morning count of the provisions, a habit her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to read, and the number had come up wrong. She stood in the feed shed doorway with the morning still gray and cool, and she counted again. Still wrong. She went to the back wall of the shed, the one that butted up against the slope of the hill, and she put her hand flat against the lowest boards. One of them moved. Not much, just enough. A 1/4 inch of give where there should have been none. She got down on her knees in the dirt and looked close, and what she found was 3 boards that had been pried away from the frame and refitted so carefully that you'd never see it standing up. You'd only see it if you were Mabel Hart, who had spent enough of her life watching men try to take things without being noticed that she had a very finely tuned sense for the evidence they left behind. She went around the outside of the shed, and there they were, hoof prints, 2 sets shod horses coming up from the east trail and looping around the back of the feed shed and going out again the same way they came. The ground was hard enough in July that they were faint, but they were there, and Mabel crouched over them for a long moment before she stood up and went to wake Elias. I was already awake. He was standing at the barn door in the early gray light, coffee in hand, watching her come across the yard with the particular stillness of a man who had gotten used to waking up to problems. Feed shed, she said. Back wall. 3 boards pried and reset. 2 horses east trail came and went. Elias looked at her over his cup. When? He said. Last 3 nights, I think. The tracks on top are fresher, but there are older ones underneath if you know where to look. I was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence of thought, but presence of it. Of it she was starting to learn the difference with him. I've been short on grain for 6 weeks, he said. I thought it was my count. Your count is right, she said. Someone's been stealing from you slow enough that you'd think it was your own error. He looked at the feed shed. That takes patience, he said. And someone who knew the layout of this property. Someone who's been here before, Mabel said. Or someone who was given a description. Neither of them said the name they were both thinking. They didn't need to. Elias drained his coffee and set the cup on the barn ledge. "I'll ride the East Trail this morning." "Take Samuel with you," Mabel said. "Don't leave him here alone." He looked at her. "You think they'd come in daylight?" "I think I don't know enough yet to make assumptions," she said. "Take the boy." He took the boy. Mabel spent the morning in the kitchen cooking and thinking. She'd learned in the 4 days she'd been here that this was how she worked. Best hands occupied mind moving, and there was always enough to occupy her hands on the Walker Ranch. The kitchen had been a disaster when she arrived. Not dirty exactly, but stripped down to almost nothing. The pantry shelved with the kind of provisions a man keeps when he has given up caring about eating well-dried, jerky hardtack coffee and not much else. She'd reorganized it on the first day. Set up a proper rotation. Found the clay pot buried in the bottom of a crate that she'd been using to keep the butter cool. Made a list of what was needed in town and what could be substituted with what was already here. Elias had watched her do all of this with the same attentive quiet he brought to everything, not getting in her way, not offering opinions she hadn't asked for. Just watching. Which was, she was finding its own particular kind of respect. She was rolling out biscuit dough. She'd found a cache of proper flour at the back of the top shelf that she'd been rationing carefully when she heard the door behind her. It was Samuel. She didn't turn around immediately. She'd learned that Samuel did not like to be looked at directly when he came into a room. He needed a moment to settle the way a skittish horse needs a moment before you reach for the bridle. She kept rolling. "Biscuits," she said. "You hungry?" A pause. Then the particular sound of a small boy climbing onto a kitchen chair. "Pa sent me back," he said. "Said the trail went too far." "Your father went on alone." "Yes, ma'am." And then, after a moment, in a voice that was trying to be casual and wasn't quite making it, "He does that, goes on alone." Mabel set down her rolling pin. She turned then and looked at the boy. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands in his lap, looking at the table, and he had that pinched quality around his eyes that she'd seen the first night, and that she was coming to understand was not hunger this time. "He always comes back," she said. Samuel looked up. "He always comes back," Mabel said again. "That kind of man always comes back." She couldn't have said how she knew it. She just did. Something about the way Elias Walker moved through the world with that particular careful deliberateness of a man who understood the weight of what depended on him, told her he was not the type to disappear. Samuel considered this for a moment. Then he said, "My mother didn't." The kitchen went very quiet. Mabel held very still. She did not make the mistake of rushing to fill the silence or drowning the boy's words in comfort before he'd finished with them. "She went to get medicine," Samuel said. "From the next town. I was 4. She didn't come back." "I'm sorry," Mabel said. Just that. She'd learned that sorry said plainly, and without a lot of architecture around it, was sometimes the only thing worth saying. Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Pa doesn't talk about it." "No," she said. "I don't suppose he does." She turned back to her biscuits. "Let the boy sit." After a while she heard him get up and come stand beside her at the table, and she shifted slightly to give him room, and he watched her work with those serious dark eyes, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. Elias came back in the early afternoon with dust on his shirt, and something new and careful in his expression. He came into the kitchen, drank half a cup of water standing at the basin, and waited until Samuel had gone out to the porch before he said anything. "The East Trail connects to the Crowland," he said. "There's a cut in the fence line at the property border. New cut wire still bright." Mabel set her stirring spoon down. "He's testing you," she said. "Seeing if you'll notice or how long it takes." "It's not about the grain," Elias said. "Grain's not worth the trouble for a man like Crow. It's about learning my routines, seeing who's here, seeing how much attention we're paying." "We." He'd said "we" without seeming to notice he'd said it. "He knows you're here," Elias said. "Word would have gotten back to him the morning after you arrived. This is—" He paused. "Crow and I have a history that doesn't have anything to do with you, and I want you to know that. What he's doing to this ranch isn't because of anything you did." "I didn't think it was," Mabel said. "What's the history?" He looked at her. "I'll tell you the part that matters," he said. "The Walker Range up here, the mountain land, the water rights, the cattle route that runs down through the valley. It was my father's. My father built it from nothing before I was born. When he died, there was a contract dispute, and Crow had enough money to tie it up in legal paper for 10 years. I've been fighting it since I was 25. And now, Mabel said, now I have a lawyer in Denver who says there's a case to be made. But Crow knows that too, and if I can't prove the ranch is operational, if the cattle route falls apart, if the water rights get seized, there's no case. There's nothing to claim. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. The water rights, she said. The spring on the north slope, he said. If I can prove continuous use, they can't be seized. But I need the ranch standing and functioning and witnessed by more than just me and a boy. She understood then something she hadn't fully understood when she accepted the job. She wasn't just here to cook and keep the kitchen. She was a witness. A living, present, credible witness to the fact that the Walker Ranch was operational and inhabited and being actively worked. Silas Crow was not stealing grain. He was trying to make Elias Walker give up and leave. He won't get what he wants, she said. Elias looked at her. Mabel. He won't get it, she said. Not while I'm here. Something shifted in Elias's expression. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter than surprise. Like a man who had been expecting a different answer for so long that the right one took a moment to register. He picked up his hat from the table. I need to repair the fence line this afternoon, he said. I could use a second pair of hands if you're willing. She was already untying her apron. They worked the fence line through the heat of the afternoon. Samuel passing wire, while Elias strung it and Mabel held the posts and handed tools, and nobody talked much because the work needed concentration. But there was something in the quality of the silence that had changed from the morning. It was not the silence of strangers. She noticed that. It was the silence of people who had said something real to each other and were still sitting with the weight of it, which was a different thing entirely. They were almost to the property border when Samuel said suddenly, "Someone's watching." Both adults went still. "Where?" Elias said quiet. "The big pine," Samuel said. "Up the slope. I saw it move twice." Elias did not look at the pine tree. He kept working slow and deliberate, and said in the same quiet voice, "How long?" "Since we started," Samuel said. Mabel kept her eyes on the wire in her hands. Her heart was going faster, but her hands were steady. "How many?" she said. "One," Samuel said. "Just one." Elias straightened up, stretched like a man working the kink out of his back, and in the process looked at the tree line for exactly as long as it would take a man to work a kink out of his back. Then he went back to the fence. "Keep working," he said. "Don't rush it. We finish the line and we go in for supper." "You're not going after them," Mabel said. "Not yet," he said. "Let them watch us fix the fence they cut. Let them take that back to Crow." She understood that too. Every cut fence repaired quickly was a message. Every morning she tallied the provisions and found them right was a message. Every meal she put on that table was a message. "I am here. This ranch is running. You are not going to wear us out." She held the post steady and let Elias string the wire, and the watcher in the pine tree watched all three of them work until the sun went lower and the shadows went long. And when they went back inside and Mabel looked up at the slope, the pine tree was still. Whoever it was had gone. That night she found the flour barrel. She'd been reorganizing the back of the pantry after supper, a task she'd been putting off because the pantry was deep and the back shelves had the accumulated disorder of years of a man living alone, and she'd dragged out a heavy barrel that she'd assumed was more hardtack, and found that it was mostly full of old flour gone to weevil, which was unfortunate, and that at the bottom of the barrel, wrapped in oilskin and tied with cord, was a leather folder. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Then she picked it up, untied the cord, and opened it. The papers inside were old, not ancient, but old enough that the edges were going brown, and the ink had gone to a deep rust color in places. They were legal documents. Land claim records, water right registrations, survey maps with boundary lines marked in careful hand. She couldn't read all of it. The legal language was dense and full of terms she didn't know, but she could read enough. She could read the name Walker at the top of every page. She could read the word registered and the dates which went back 30 years. She could read on the last page a separate document in different ink that made her go very still. It was a letter, handwritten on what had been good paper once, and it was addressed to someone she knew. It was addressed to Silas Crow, and it was signed at the bottom by a county clerk Mabel had never heard of. But the date on the letter was 2 years after the last official land claim document, and the content of it. The content she could make out in the cramped handwriting was about an amendment, a correction, a revision to the boundary survey that had resulted somehow in the Walker water rights being transferred to a holding company with a name she didn't recognize, but that had Crow's particular fingerprints all over it. Her hands were not shaking. She was proud of that. She rewrapped the oilskin, tied the cord, and carried the folder to the kitchen table, and she sat and waited. Elias came down from the loft where he'd been going over his accounts at the 20 minutes later. He stopped when he saw her face. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She opened the folder and laid the papers out one at a time in order, and when she got to the letter, she put it in front of him and watched his face. He read it once. Then he read it again. His jaw went tight, and then carefully untight, the way a man who has spent years learning to govern his anger manages the moment when the anger finds a new reason to be large. "Where did you find this?" he said. "The flour barrel," she said. "At the back of the pantry. I think your father put it there." Elias looked at the letter. "He knew," he said very quietly. "He had this, and he must have hidden it before he died. He must have known Crow would come looking," Mabel said. "He hid it where someone would find it eventually, if they were running a real kitchen." Elias was quiet for a long time. The lamp on the table made everything amber and close. Samuel was asleep in the back room, and the ranch was still around them, and Mabel sat with her hands flat on the table, and let the man across from her sit with what he was feeling until he was done sitting with it. "This changes things," he said finally. "It changes everything," she said. "This letter, if it shows what I think it shows, this isn't a contract dispute. This is fraud. This is Silas Crow paying someone to alter a legal document. I need to get this to my lawyer in Denver." "You need to keep it safe first," Mabel said. "And you need to do it without Crow's man seeing you ride out." He looked at her across the table. "You're thinking like someone who knows how dangerous this is." "I'm thinking like someone who's been on the losing side of a Silas Crow arrangement before," she said. "My father's debt. I've never been able to prove it was forged, but I know it was." She straightened the papers. "Now maybe I can." The lamp flickered. Outside, something moved in the cottonwood tree at the corner of the yard, a nightbird probably, and the sound of it settled back into the ordinary sounds of the night, which were all the sounds of a mountain ranch that was still standing, still breathing, still refusing to give. Elias looked at the papers in front of him. Then he looked at Mabel. "I thought I was hiring someone to keep the kitchen," he said. "You were," she said. "The kitchen just turned out to have more in it than either of us expected." He almost smiled. She was starting to learn the geography of that almost smile, the particular set of the mouth, the slight easing around the eyes, and she looked away before she spent too long learning it, because she was a woman who knew the difference between what was real and what the heart could be fooled into wanting, and she was not in the business of fooling herself. She collected the papers, wrapped them back in the oilskin, and this time she did not put them in the flour barrel. She put them somewhere better, somewhere that not even Elias knew about yet, because trust was something you built piece by piece, and she was only 4 days in. She told him where in the morning. He said, "Good thinking." She said, "I know." And she went to make the coffee because the sun was already coming, and there was work to do, and Silas Crow's man would be watching again today. And every ordinary morning on the Walker Ranch was one more day Elias kept what his father built. She intended to give him as many of those days as the summer held. The letter went to Denver on the 8th day. Elias rode out before sunup, not on the main trail, but on the old logging track that cut west along the ridge before dropping down to the valley road 3 miles south of Dry Creek, which was 3 miles south of anyone Crow had watching the obvious routes. Mabel had packed him food without being asked, and had the coffee ready at 4 in the morning, and had not made anything of it, which he seemed to appreciate in the particular quiet way. He appreciated things. A slight pause, a look. The kind of acknowledgement that didn't require words, because the words would have made it smaller. Samuel stayed at the ranch with Mabel. This was not discussed. It was simply what happened. Elias saddled his horse in the dark, and Samuel stood in the barn doorway watching him and Elias crouch down in front of the boy, and said something low that Mabel couldn't hear, and Samuel nodded once, the nod of a child who has been given a responsibility and intends to honor it. Then Elias stood mounted, looked once at Mabel standing at the kitchen door, and rode out into the dark without a word. Samuel came and sat at the kitchen table and ate his breakfast, and did not say he was worried because he was his father's son. Mabel did not say she was worried either because she had no right to be. Elias Walker was not hers to worry about. He was her employer. She was his hired hand, and increasingly, his accidental investigator. And none of that entitled her to the specific tightness in her chest that accompanied watching him disappear into the dark on a trail she couldn't see. She washed the breakfast dishes and went out to the feed shed to do the morning count. It was on the 9th day that Denny Voss came to the ranch. She knew who he was before he introduced himself, because she had seen him twice in Dry Creek, once standing outside Silas Crow's office, and once riding behind Crow's buggy. And because he had the particular quality of a man who believed his employer's importance transferred to him by proximity. He rode up to the yard gate mid-morning on a good horse dressed better than a ranch hand had any business dressing, and he did not dismount. Samuel was on the porch. He stood up from where he'd been sitting and went very still in the way Mabel had come to understand meant he was paying close attention. Mabel came out of the kitchen and stood at the top of the porch steps with a dish towel in her hands and waited. "Walker here," Denny Voss said. "No," Mabel said. "When's he back?" "I couldn't say." Voss looked at her. He did the thing men like him did, which was to look at her the way Roy Finch looked at her in the store. A slow, deliberate inventory that was meant to diminish, meant to remind her of every way she failed to meet whatever standard he'd set in his mind. Mabel had been looked at that way enough times that she had developed a response to it, which was to stand very still and let it finish the way you let a storm finish, because fighting weather was a waste of effort. "Mr. Crow would like to speak with Walker," Voss said, "about the boundary survey." "I'll tell him when he returns," Mabel said. "Mr. Crow would prefer sooner than later." "Mr. Crow's preferences," Mabel said pleasantly, "are not something I have any particular obligation to accommodate." Voss's expression changed. Not dramatically, it was a controlled face, a practiced face, but something behind the eyes shifted the way a man's eyes shift when he's recalibrating a situation he thought he had read correctly. "You're the Hart woman," he said. "I'm Miss Hart," she said. "Yes. You know your father's outstanding debt is a matter between Mr. Crow's lawyers and mine," she said. "When I have one. And until I do, it's not a conversation I'm having with his errand man." The word errand landed. She watched it land. Voss's jaw went tight, and for a moment she saw something in his face that was less controlled than the rest of him. Something that told her she'd be smarter to be more careful, and she filed that information away. "Tell Walker," Voss said. "Mr. Crow is making an offer. One time." He turned his horse and rode out. Samuel came and stood beside Mabel. They both watched Voss go. "He's going to come back," Samuel said. "Yes," Mabel said. "With more people." "Probably," she said. She put her hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Just briefly is enough. "Come help me with the bread. I need someone to watch the oven." Samuel went inside. Mabel stood one more moment at the top of the porch steps, watching the gate where Voss had been, and did the arithmetic on what that visit had cost them in terms of time. Elias had been gone since before dawn. He would be back by nightfall, she hoped. Between now and nightfall, she was alone on this ranch with a 6-year-old boy and a set of documents she'd moved to the third hiding place 2 days ago because she trusted her instincts about Voss and men like him. She went inside and made bread and kept her ears open all afternoon. Elias came back at dusk. He came in tired and dusty, and with the particular tight expression of a man who has ridden 30 miles and had a difficult conversation at the end of it. But when Mabel said, "Denny Voss was here," he sat down at the table and listened to all of it without interrupting, which told her his Denver news could wait. "What offer?" he said. He didn't specify, said one time only. Elias was quiet for a moment. "Crow's getting nervous," he said. "Why now?" "Because I told my lawyer the same thing I found is probably in the county records too," Elias said. "If someone knows where to look and is willing to look." Crow has been paying that county clerk for years. But paper has a way of surviving people who want it gone. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded paper. He put it on the table. "The Denver lawyer says there's enough for an injunction against the water rights seizure. He's filing next week. But Crow has friends on the district bench, and if he gets there first..." He stopped. "We need witnesses, real ones. People in Dry Creek who have seen this ranch operating who will say so in court. And we need them willing to stand against Silas Crow, which is not a small thing to ask. Mabel looked at the paper on the table. I'll witness, she said. Mabel. I will stand in front of whoever needs to hear it and say what I have seen, she said. I kept your accounts for 3 weeks. I know exactly how this ranch operates. That's a fact, not a favor. He looked at her for a long moment. If you do that, Crow will go after your father's debt. Hard. He'll move the deadline forward call in every contact he has, make your life as difficult as he possibly can. My life, Mabel said, is already as difficult as it possibly can be. He doesn't have much leverage left to pull. Elias said nothing for a moment. Then, your father's debt. You said it was forged. I've believed it was forged since the week after my father died, she said. He was meticulous with money. I kept the books with him from the time I was 12 years old. The numbers he died with didn't match the numbers I knew, but I had no proof. The letter in the flour barrel, Elias said slowly. The county clerk. If Crow was doing it to my father's land claim, he was doing it to others. That's what I think, Mabel said. Then your father's debt document might be in the same clerk's handwriting. She had thought this. She had been thinking this for 9 days every morning when she did the provisions count, and every night when she remade the arithmetic of her own situation. She had not said it out loud yet, because saying it out loud made it something she would have to pursue, something that could fail, and she had already absorbed enough failure for one lifetime. But Elias Walker was looking at her across the table with those steady creek-colored eyes, and he was saying it like it was a fact and not a hope. And she found that the difference between those two things, when it was someone else's voice saying it, was considerable. Yes, she said. It might be. The next morning, she found the well. Not found it the way you find something lost. The well had been there since Elias's father had it dug 20-odd years back, and it was the primary water source for both the ranch house and the stock. She found it in the way she found the loose boards in the feed shed, by being the kind of person who checked, who counted, who put her hand on things and paid attention to what they told her. The well rope was wrong. The tension was different from the morning before, and when she pulled it up slowly, the bucket came up with a particular resistance that it hadn't had yesterday. She got the bucket over the edge and looked inside. Someone had dropped rocks in. Not boulders that would have been too obvious, too hard to do without noise. Small rocks. Dozens of them, the kind you could carry in a burlap sack without much trouble, dropped in through the night, while the ranch slept slow enough and quiet enough that no single sound would have carried to the barn where Elias slept. It was methodical. It was patient. And it was serious, because a compromised well in July in a drought year was not a minor inconvenience. It was an existential problem for livestock and people both. She went and woke Elias. He stood at the well and looked down, and his face went through several things rapidly, none of which he said out loud. Then he said, "How many?" "I can't tell without draining it," she said. "But enough to matter. If the rocks are bigger at the bottom, I'll go down," he said. "Not alone," she said. "Mabel." "Not alone," she said. "I'll hold the rope." He looked at her. Then he took off his shirt and went over the edge of the well on the rope, hand over hand, and Mabel held the other end braced around the post and let it out in careful increments, and did not let herself think about anything except the tension in the rope and the sounds coming up from below, which were the sounds of water and rock, and a man working in a confined space with pragmatic efficiency. I was down there for 40 minutes. Mabel held the rope, and Samuel sat on the edge of the well housing and looked down into the dark, and they didn't talk. When Elias came back up, his arms were shaking slightly from the climb, and he was soaked from the chest down, and he had gotten out enough rocks that the well was functional though not right, and would need proper clearing when they had more time and help. He sat on the ground and caught his breath. Mabel handed him the water jug from her apron pocket. She'd started carrying water on her person, a habit from knowing how fast July heat could get dangerous, and he drank half of it without stopping. "There's something else down there," he said. She waited. "There's a timber brace at the bottom," he said. "Old one, and someone has partially cut it." He looked at her. "Not recently. This was done a while back, maybe a month before I got back to the ranch. If that brace goes, the well collapses," she said. "The whole thing," he said. "You wouldn't be able to dig it again, not without professional equipment and money I don't have. You'd have to relocate the entire operation. She sat down on the ground across from him. They were both quiet for a moment, with the morning heat coming on, and the well between them, and all the implications of what he'd just said, spreading out in the air like dust. He's been planning this longer than we thought, she said. Before I even came back, Elias said. Before I had a lawyer in Denver. Before anything. A hand over his face. He wanted the ranch to fail by itself. No obvious interference, just a well that collapses in summer, a feed shed that goes short, a fence line that keeps needing repair. The kind of failures that look like a man who can't manage his own property. Because in court, Mabel said, a ranch that's failing manages itself isn't proof of continuous use. Exactly. He looked at the well. My father's claim requires 10 years of continuous productive use. Crow's been dismantling the evidence of that use piece by piece from the inside and making it look like my own neglect. She thought about the letter in the flour barrel. She thought about her father's debt. She thought about the clerk's handwriting and what else might be in that county records office buried in the kind of careful legal language that ordinary people didn't know how to read. I need to go to Dry Creek, she said. Elias looked at her sharply. Why? The county records office, she said. I grew up in this county. I know the clerk, the current one, not the one who signed that letter. He retired 4 years ago. I know his wife. I know what he looks like when he's lying. Crow has people watching you in town, Elias said. I know, she said. That's actually useful. Because what they'll report back to him is that I came to town to look at my father's debt records, which is something a woman in my position would do on her own without any connection to you. It gives me a reason to be in the records office that has nothing to do with Walker land claims. Elias was looking at her with an expression she was having trouble categorizing. It wasn't doubt. It was something more like recalibration, like a man continually arriving at a version of events slightly more complex than the one he'd prepared for. And while you're looking at your father's debt records, he said slowly, I'm also looking at anything filed by that retired clerk in the last 10 years, she said, which would include any amendments to boundary surveys, which might include documentation of how and when those amendments were made, and possibly, she paused, possibly the original documents they were meant to replace. He was quiet for a long moment. That's a considerable risk, he said. Yes, she said. If Crow figures out what you're actually doing, he'll move on the debt and try to remove me from the county before I can testify, she said. I know, that's why I need to go tomorrow before he has time to realize what we found in your pantry. Elias stood up. He put the water jug back, pulled his shirt back on. He stood for a moment with his back to her, looking at the fence line at the edge of the property. Then he turned around. I'm coming with you, he said. That's the worst possible idea, she said. If we ride into Dry Creek together after Voss's visit, Crow will know immediately that. I'm not sending you in alone, Elias said. His voice was level, but there was something in it that was not negotiable, that came from some place in him, that was not about strategy, and was not about the ranch, and was not. She thought entirely about the legal case either. She looked at him. You'll stay out of the records office, she said finally. You'll be visible somewhere else, the livery, the hardware store. Somewhere that gives you a reason to be in town that has nothing to do with me. Agreed, he said. And you'll let me handle what happens in that office on my own. A pause. Agreed. Good, she said. She stood up and brushed the dirt off her skirt. Then we go tomorrow morning. And tonight, I need you to write down everything your lawyer told you about what documents we need. Every specific detail. Because I'm not going to get a second chance at those records, and I need to know exactly what I'm looking for. He nodded once. She went back to the kitchen. She had bread in the oven, and Samuel's lunch to make, and a list to compile, and a hiding place to check. And the day was not getting shorter, and Silas Crow's patience, she had learned enough about him now to understand this was not infinite. Neither was hers. They rode into Dry Creek the next morning side by side, and separated at the edge of town without a word, like two people who had agreed on a plan and trusted each other to execute it, which was exactly what they were. Mabel went straight to the records office. The county clerk was a thin man named Henderson, who wore the same brown vest every day and had the defensive energy of someone who knew more than he was comfortable knowing. He looked up when Mabel came in, and something moved through his expression. Not guilt, she thought. Unease. The kind that comes from being caught in proximity to a larger thing and not knowing what to do about it. "Miss Hart," he said. "I need to look at my father's debt records," she said. "The original filings from 3 years ago. I got them for her." She sat at the reading table, and she looked at them slowly, the way a woman reviewing her father's estate would look at them. And while she looked at them, she was noting the clerk's handwriting, and when Henderson went to the back room to retrieve another file for another patron who came in, she stood up and moved to the filing cabinet that contained boundary survey amendments from the past 12 years. And she went through them quickly and quietly, with the practiced hands of a woman who had been keeping accounts since childhood. She found the first one in under 4 minutes, then the second. By the time Henderson came back from the back room, she was seated again, her father's debt papers in front of her hands folded on top of them, and she had memorized every document number and filing date that she needed, which was a skill she had not known until this moment that she possessed. She looked up at Henderson. He looked at her. Something passed between them. She wasn't sure what exactly, except that Henderson was a man who was tired, and she was a woman who understood being tired in a particular way, and they both understood something about the other in that moment that neither one of them could have put into words. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said. "Miss Hart," he said. And then quietly, like a man making a calculation he'd been putting off for some time, the filing dates on those amendments. If someone were to look at them against the original surveys, the ones in the territorial office in Denver, not the county copies. He stopped. Mabel looked at him. "The territorial office," she said equally quietly. "Not the county copies. The originals," he said very carefully, "don't always match the county versions. In cases where amendments were filed after the fact, by a previous clerk." He met her eyes. "That's all I'll say." She stood up, collected her things, and left the records office with her pulse going fast and steady, like a horse that knows it's close to home. Outside 30 feet up the street, she saw Elias coming out of the hardware store. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him, but she allowed herself for exactly 3 steps, the full weight of what Henderson had just told her. The county copies didn't match the originals. Silas Crow had not just forged an amendment. He had replaced the county records entirely, leaving the originals intact in Denver, where no one who didn't know to look would ever think to look. She had the document numbers. She had the filing dates. She had a Denver lawyer with a client who had every right to request the territorial originals. She walked to the end of Main Street and turned the corner and stood for a moment with her back against the wall of the livery and let herself breathe. Elias came around the corner 30 seconds later. He looked at her face. "You found something," he said. "I found everything," she said, "and the summer sky above." Dry Creek was the hard, bright blue of a day that was about to change, and Mabel Hart stood in the shade of the livery and told Elias Walker what the county clerk had just very carefully told her, and she watched the man in front of her understand what it meant. They rode back to the ranch in near silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the ride in. Fuller. Charged. Like the air before a summer storm, when you can feel the electricity before a single cloud has built. Elias sent the letter to Denver that same afternoon. Not by the logging track this time, there wasn't time for caution over speed, but by a boy named Pete Gruber, who was 14 years old, the son of a widow who lived 4 miles south of town and who had no connection to Crow and no reason to be watched. Mabel had suggested him. She'd known Pete Gruber since he was 9 years old, and had occasionally traded baked goods for firewood with his mother, which was the kind of relationship Dry Creek's economy ran on at its lower registers, and which Crow's men who dealt in money and legal paper had never thought to map. Pete took the letter and the document numbers and the filing dates written in Mabel's small, precise hand, and he rode south without looking back, and Elias watched him go from the fence line with his arms crossed and something working in his jaw. "How long for the lawyer to pull the territorial originals?" Mabel asked. "If he moves fast, 3 days to request them. Another 2 for the territorial office to locate and confirm. He'll telegraph when he has them." Elias turned away from the fence. "Which means we have at best 5 days before anything moves in Denver. And once Crow figures out that the records office was visited by more than just a woman reviewing her father's debt." "Henderson won't tell him," Mabel said. Elias looked at her. "You're certain? He's been sitting on what he knows for 4 years, she said. He didn't tell Crow then. He's not going to tell him now that someone finally came looking. She paused. He's a man who's been waiting for permission to do the right thing. I think we just gave it to him." Elias said nothing for a moment. Then, "And if Crow figures it out another way, then we deal with it," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with that recalibrating expression she had catalogued over the past 2 weeks, the one that appeared when she said something he hadn't prepared for, and then he nodded once and went to check the stock. Mabel went back to the kitchen and put supper on, and did not let herself think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead was how hope got ahead of facts, and she had survived this long by keeping those two things carefully separated. The telegram arrived on the third day. It came through the Dry Creek Telegraph office addressed to Elias Walker, and the boy who brought it out to the ranch was the same Pete Gruber, who apparently had decided that being useful to Elias Walker was a sustainable occupation and had made himself available accordingly. Mabel liked him more each time she saw him. Elias read the telegram twice. Then he handed it to Mabel without a word. The Denver lawyer's message was short. He had retrieved 3 of the 5 documents from the territorial office. All 3 showed clear discrepancies from the county versions on file in Dry Creek. The discrepancies were not minor clerical errors. They were substantive alterations to boundary coordinates and water right designations. He was requesting an emergency injunction hearing and had filed with the federal circuit bypassing the district bench entirely. The district bench where Crow had friends. The federal circuit where he did not. "He went federal," Mabel said. "He went federal," Elias confirmed. "How long until the hearing?" "He says 2 weeks, maybe less." Elias folded the telegram and put it in his shirt pocket. "Which means Crow is going to find out before then. He has people at the federal office too, just not as many." "How will he react?" Elias looked at her steadily. "He's going to move on you," he said. "Your father's debt. He's going to call it in immediately and push for eviction on the cabin before you can get in front of a judge. He'll try to remove you from the county as a witness." Mabel had known this was coming. She had known it since the morning she'd walked into Henderson's records office. She had done the arithmetic on it, the way she did the arithmetic on everything. Clear-eyed, without flinching, counting the numbers as they actually were. "When?" she said. "If I had to guess, he already knows," Elias said. "Voss has been watching this ranch. The day we rode into town together, even separated, he'll have connected it." "Then he's moving now," Mabel said. "Probably," Elias said. She untied her apron, folded it over the back of the kitchen chair, and stood up straight. "Then I need to go to my cabin," she said. "There are papers there, my father's original ledgers, the accounts he kept himself that I need before Crow's people get there first." Elias was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. "I'm riding with you." "I know," she said. "Go saddle the horses." Samuel appeared in the doorway, with the uncanny timing of a child who has learned to listen for the particular quality of urgency in adult voices. He looked at his father. He looked at Mabel. "I'm coming," he said. Elias started to say no. Mabel said, "He's right. We're not leaving him here alone." They rode hard. The cabin was still standing when they got there, which Mabel noted with the specific relief of someone who had genuinely considered the alternative. Widow Marsh was in her garden next door, and she straightened up when she saw the 3 of them come down the track at speed, and her expression told Mabel everything. "When," Mabel said, pulling up at the fence. "An hour ago," the widow said. "2 men. They looked in the windows. They didn't go in. I was watching and I think they knew it. But they'll be back." "Did they speak to you?" "One of them told me Crow had given notice on the cabin debt, and it would be surrendered by end of week." The widow's voice was tight with anger. She was a small, iron-spined woman in her 60s who had outlasted a husband, a drought, and 2 rounds of town council corruption, and she did not like Silas Crow. "I told him he could relay a message back to Mr. Crow from me that I've lived next to this cabin for 20 years, and I'll be at any eviction hearing they care to schedule, and I'll have something to say." Mabel looked at the widow for a moment. Then she reached over the fence and pressed her hand. "Thank you," she said. "Get what you need and get out before they come back," the widow said. Mabel went in. She knew exactly where everything was, because she had put it all there herself, organized and accounted for the way she organized everything. Her father's ledgers were in the trunk under the bed, 3 of them covering the last 7 years of his accounts, written in his careful hand that she knew as well as her own. She pulled them out, wrapped them in the cloth she'd brought for the purpose, and put them in the saddlebag. Then she stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment. She had lived here since she was 12 years old. She had cooked in this kitchen, and mended in this chair, and sat on this porch through summer heat and winter cold, and every ordinary day in between. She had watched her father grow old in this cabin, and she had sat beside him while he died in it, and now Silas Crow was going to take it, and there was nothing she could do about that yet. Not yet, not today. But the ledgers were in the bag, and the truth was in them, and that was what mattered. She walked out without looking back. Elias was waiting at the fence. He looked at her face when she came out, and he didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Samuel handed her the reins. They rode back to the mountain. That night, Mabel sat at the kitchen table with the 3 ledgers open in front of her and went through them page by page, and what she found over 3 hours of careful reading was what she had suspected and dreaded and hoped for in equal measure. Her father had been meticulous. Every transaction recorded, every payment noted, every debt entered and marked off when settled. The ledger for the year he died showed the full payment history of the note. Crow claimed was outstanding payment after payment, regular as heartbeat recorded in her father's hand, with dates and amounts. The final entry, written 2 weeks before he died, noted a remaining balance of $14. $14. Crow's claim was for $260. She sat with that for a long moment. Not with anger. The anger was there, it was always there, but she'd learned to set it aside and use the space it occupied for thinking. She sat with it, and she thought about the clerk's handwriting in the records office, and the letter at the bottom of the flour barrel, and the way one man's patient, methodical dishonesty had reached into the lives of ordinary people for years, and taken from them the things they couldn't afford to lose. Her father had died believing he owed a debt he'd nearly paid off. She closed the ledger very carefully. Then she opened her father's last account book again, the one covering the final year of his life, and she turned to the very last page, past the last entry, past the final tally, and found something she had missed on the first read-through. Her father had written something on the inside back cover. Small, cramped, like a man writing quickly or writing in pain. She had to tilt the lamp to read it. It said, "Check the original note." Crow changed the number. "I saw him do it. I can't prove it. Mabel, if you find this, check the original." She stared at that for a long time. Her father had known. I had known, and he'd been dying, and he hadn't been able to do anything about it, except leave the only message he could in the one place he trusted she would eventually look. She pressed her hand flat over those words, and she did not cry because there was no time for that, but she sat with her hand over her father's handwriting, and she let herself feel the full weight of what it meant that he had trusted her to find it. Then she straightened up, closed the ledger, and went to the barn. Elias was awake. She didn't know if she'd expected him to be or not, but he was sitting on the hay bale just inside the barn door with a lamp burning low beside him, and he looked up when she came in, and she sat down across from him, and she told him everything. The final ledger entry, the $14 balance, the note on the inside back cover in her father's handwriting. Elias listened to all of it without a word. "He watched Crow do it," Mabel said. "Change the number. He was too sick to fight it, and too honest to let it go unrecorded." "The original note," Elias said. "Where would it be?" "If Crow filed it as part of the debt claim, it'll be in the county records," she said. "But if the county copy has been altered—" "The territorial originals," Elias said. She nodded. "If my father ever registered the original loan note with the territorial office, which he might have, he was that kind of careful, it'll be there. Unaltered. Matching the ledger." Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "If we can get that to Denver alongside the land claim documents, then Crow isn't just facing a property dispute," Mabel said. "He's facing fraud on multiple accounts across multiple victims over multiple years." She looked at Elias. "Henderson isn't the only one who knows. There are other people in this county who've lost land or money to altered documents. If your lawyer can demonstrate the pattern—" "It becomes a federal matter," Elias said. "Not just a boundary dispute between two property owners." "Yes," she said. Howe was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Your father protected you the best way he knew how." She had been doing well. She had been holding it together with both hands for 3 hours through the ledgers and the lamp and the careful reading and the arithmetic of loss. But something about the way Elias said it plain direct without softening or sentimentality undid something in her chest that had been knotted tight for 3 years. She looked away. She looked at the barn wall, and she breathed carefully until the knotted thing retied itself. "He did," she said when she could. Elias did not fill the silence. He let her have it, the way he let her have all the silences she needed, which was something she had come to understand was not a small thing. After a moment she said, "I need to write to your lawyer tonight. I need to tell him about the note and give him the specific dates and amounts from the ledger, so he knows what he's looking for in the territorial files." "I'll write it with you," Elias said. They went back inside. Samuel was asleep. The lamp on the kitchen table was still burning, the ledgers still open to the last page of the last year of her father's careful life, and they sat across from each other and wrote the letter together, Mabel dictating and Elias's handwriting going down the page in steady lines. When it was done and folded and ready for Pete Gruber in the morning, Elias set down the pen and looked at her across the table. "Mabel," he said. She looked up. "When this is over," he said, "when the case is settled and Crow is dealt with, I want you to know that whatever you decide to do after you have a place here, as long as you want it." She looked at him. "A place," she said carefully. "Whatever that means to you," he said. "Hired hand partner, whatever the word is that you're comfortable with." He paused. "I'm not good at this. I know that." "You're doing fine," she said. "I don't want to assume, Elias." She said it firmly enough that he stopped. "You're doing fine." He picked up the pen and set it down again. Then he said, "The town is going to talk." "The town," she said, "has been talking about me my whole life. I have stopped finding it instructive." He made the sound that was almost not a smile. She had learned it now. She knew exactly what it meant, had its geography completely memorized in a way she was not fully examining. "There's a public auction," he said. "Next Friday. Crow filed it through the county 2 weeks ago. It was already in motion before we found the letter. He's planned to auction the cabin and the water rights on the same day. 2 birds." He looked at her. "He'll be there. The whole town will be there. And he'll use it. He'll use it to make what we're doing look like a desperate legal fiction cooked up by a mountain cowboy and a woman with no standing. He'll use me," Mabel said. "Specifically, the way he always has." Yes. She thought about that. She thought about Roy Finch and the flower counter and the way Clara Hendricks pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. She thought about every piece of herself she had swallowed back down over 27 years of being looked at and found wanting and expected to absorb it quietly. "Good," she said. Elias looked at her. "Let him," she said. "Let him put me in front of the whole town and use me as the reason none of this is serious. Because I'll have 3 ledgers and a letter and document numbers from the territorial office, and he will have—" She met Elias's eyes. "What will he have?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "A lot of money," he said. "And men who work for it. And we'll have the truth," she said. "Which I grant you is historically the underdog in these situations. But the truth has something money doesn't." "What's that?" "It doesn't change," she said. "You can bury it and alter it and file false copies and pay clerks to look the other way. But the original is always sitting somewhere exactly as it was waiting for someone willing to go find it." She closed her father's ledger. "I've been going to find it my whole life. I just didn't know that until now." The lamp burned between them. Outside the ranch was still the summer dark, full of insect sound and the breathing of sleeping stock. The cottonwood at the corner of the yard doing its dry whisper in the night breeze. Elias Walker looked at Mabel Hart across his kitchen table with an expression she had no name for yet, but which she intended when she had more time to think about carefully. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she said. "And I'll need a clean dress." He blinked. It was so close to a real full reaction that she almost laughed. "There's a dressmaker on the south end of Main Street," he said. "Mrs. Aldridge. She's fair." "I'll go tomorrow afternoon," Mabel said. "And I'll take Samuel with me, because nothing says ordinary business like a woman and a child buying cloth." She stood, collected the ledgers, and banked the kitchen fire for the night. At the door of the kitchen she paused. "Elias," she said. He looked up. "Your father hid those papers in the flour barrel because he believed someone would come back to this ranch and make it run again," she said. "He believed that enough to make sure the evidence survived him. She held his gaze. He was right. She went to her room. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, it was the sleep of a woman who knows exactly what the next day requires of her and is not afraid of it. Mrs. Aldridge's dress was pale blue cotton, simple and well cut, and it fit Mabel the way clothes rarely fit her, without apology, without the particular indignity of fabric that pulled and bunched in all the ways that reminded her of every look she'd ever absorbed in Roy Finch's store. Samuel had sat on the dressmaker's bench while the fitting happened and had declared the color good, which was the most enthusiasm she had yet heard from him on any subject unrelated to beetles, and she had told him his opinion was noted and appreciated. She wore it on Friday. The auction was set for 10 in the morning in front of the county building, which was where all public business of consequence happened in Dry Creek: land transfers, estate settlements, debt collections, the machinery of financial ruin conducted in plain sight, so that everyone could see what happened to people who couldn't keep up. Mabel had watched 3 auctions from the edge of the crowd in her lifetime, and had understood each time that the watching was part of the purpose, that the public nature of it was not incidental, but deliberate, a demonstration of what power looked like when it moved openly because it had nothing to fear. She rode in with Elias on one side and Samuel on the other, and she sat straight in the saddle, and she did not look at the people who stopped to watch them pass. There were more people on the street than a typical Friday morning. Word had gotten around, it always did in a town this size, and the combination of a contested land auction and Elias Walker appearing in public after weeks on the mountain had drawn a crowd. Mabel recognized most of the faces. She had grown up here. She knew who owed debts to Crow, and who had received favors from him, and who walked the careful middle line of people who knew something was wrong and had decided that knowing was enough, that acting was more than could reasonably be expected. She understood all of them. She had been all of them at various points. She dismounted at the hitching post and handed her reins to Samuel and said quietly, "Stay with the horses until I call for you." Samuel looked at her with those dark, serious eyes and nodded. Elias came to stand beside her. "You ready?" he said. "I've been ready for 3 years," she said. "I just didn't have the right papers." They walked toward the county building. Silas Crow was already there. He was standing on the steps in his good suit, the gray one that said money without quite shouting it, flanked by Denny Voss and a lawyer. Mabel didn't recognize someone brought in from outside. She guessed someone with no local loyalties to complicate his usefulness. Crow was talking to the county auctioneer, a nervous man named Briggs, who had the posture of someone wishing he were somewhere else, and when he saw Elias Walker coming up the street, he stopped talking mid-sentence. His eyes moved to Mabel, down and up the familiar inventory. Then something in his expression shifted, not to the contempt she was used to, but to something more calculated. Like a man reassessing a piece on a board, he thought he'd already won. "Walker," Crow said. His voice was pleasant. He was always pleasant. That was the thing about Silas Crow that had taken Mabel the longest to understand, that pleasantness and danger were not opposites that a man could wear courtesy like a weapon. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "I imagine not," Elias said. Crow's eyes went back to Mabel. "Miss Hart, I'm sorry about the circumstances. The debt is a matter of contract, nothing personal." "Of course," Mabel said. She kept her voice as pleasant as his. She had learned from watching him how to do that. Crow looked at the saddlebag she was carrying. His eyes stayed on it a beat too long. "We should let the proceedings get underway," he said to Briggs. The crowd had gathered properly. Now 20 or 30 people arranged in the loose semicircle that formed for public auctions, and Briggs climbed the steps and cleared his throat and began the standard preamble about the properties under consideration and the legal notices that had been filed. Mabel stood in the crowd and listened and counted. She counted Widow Marsh, who had ridden in early and was standing near the front with her arms crossed. She counted Tom Greer, who ran the small ranch east of the creek, and who owed Crow a note she happened to know had been paid 18 months ago because Tom's wife had mentioned it at the dry goods store. She counted Henderson, the county clerk, who was standing at the far edge of the crowd in his brown vest, and who, when Mabel caught his eye, looked away first, but looked away in the direction of Briggs, not toward the ground. She counted Pete Gruber's mother, who had no legal stake in any of this, and who had come anyway. She counted enough. Briggs got through the preamble and announced the first property, the Hart family cabin, and lot debt amount stated as $260 outstanding. Crow's lawyer stepped forward with papers. Mabel stepped forward too. "I'd like to enter a dispute of the debt amount," she said. Briggs stopped. The crowd went quiet in the particular way crowds go quiet when something unexpected happens in a proceeding designed to be unsurprising. Crow said smoothly, "Miss Hart, the legal period for disputes has passed." "I'm not disputing through county records," Mabel said. She opened the saddlebag and took out the first ledger. "I'm disputing through my father's own accounts kept in his own hand, which show a remaining balance of $14 at the time of his death, not $260. She put the ledger on the step beside Briggs and opened it to the final page. Crow's lawyer said, "The county filing does not match the original note registered with the territorial office," Mabel said. The crowd shifted. Crow's pleasant expression had developed a specific quality around the edges. Not alarm, he was too controlled for alarm, but concentration. The sharpened focus of a man redirecting resources to an unexpected problem. "The territorial office records are administrative," his lawyer said. "Any discrepancies are clerical." 3 separate discrepancies across 3 separate documents, Elias said from beside Mabel. "All in the same direction, all benefiting the same party." He reached into his own coat and produced the telegram from Denver. "My lawyer in Denver is in front of the federal circuit this morning with the originals. The hearing has already begun." The word federal went through the crowd like a current. Crow turned to Elias. The pleasantness was gone. What was underneath it was not dramatic. Crow was not a dramatic man, but it was cold in the way of something that has been operating at a very low temperature for a very long time. "You have nothing," Crow said, quietly, meant only for Elias. "You have a woman with a household ledger and a telegram that could say anything. I have the original water right registration for the Walker Range," Elias said, equally quiet. "Filed in 1847 by my father. The county copy was amended in 1871 without his knowledge or consent. The territorial original was not. The difference between those 2 documents is the entire basis of your claim to the spring on the North Slope, and the federal circuit has both copies in front of them right now." Crow was still. The particular stillness of a man in the process of calculating. Mabel watched him calculate, and she took 1 step forward. "Mr. Crow," she said, not quietly, clearly, at a volume the crowd could hear. "My father paid his debt. I have his records. I have the original note that you altered after he was too ill to contest it. I have a letter in name, acknowledging the arrangement with the county clerk who made the alteration." She held the letter from the flour barrel up in her hand where everyone could see it. "And I have 17 years of my father's accounts that will take any honest court approximately 20 minutes to verify." Crow looked at the letter in her hand. His jaw was tight. "You don't know what you're holding," he said. "I know exactly what I'm holding," she said. "And so does everyone standing here." The crowd was absolutely silent. Then, Widow Marsh said loudly from the front row, "My husband's water note. Crow told me it was unpaid when James died. I have James's receipt book." Silence. Then Tom Greer said, "My fence line was surveyed wrong 3 years ago. I paid to resurvey it myself. The original survey had my eastern acre inside Crow's boundary." A woman Mabel didn't know well said, "My brother-in-law lost his claim in 1869. He always said the numbers were wrong. It was not a flood. It was not a dramatic uprising. It was 3 people, and then a 4th, and then a 5th, speaking in the careful, measured voices of people who have been waiting to say something for a long time, and are finally calculating that the cost of silence has exceeded the cost of speaking." Crow turned to Denny Voss. Whatever instruction he was about to give, he didn't finish it because Sheriff Burl Tackett, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd in the particular way that law enforcement stands at public events, stepped forward. Mabel had not been sure about Tackett. He was not a Crow man exactly, but he was a careful man, a man who understood the arithmetic of power in a small town and had navigated it for 15 years by knowing when to see things and when to look elsewhere. She had factored him as a risk. But Tackett had apparently been doing his own arithmetic. "Mr. Crow," Tackett said, "I'm going to need you to come with me while we sort out the question of these documents." Crow looked at him. "You don't have authority to." "I have a telegram from the federal marshal's office," Tackett said, and produced it from his vest pocket, with the air of a man who has been waiting for the right moment with more patience than anyone had given him credit for. "Arrived yesterday morning. It asks for your cooperation in a records investigation and requests that I ensure you remain available for questioning." He looked at Crow steadily. I've been waiting to see how this morning went before I delivered it. Denny Voss took a step back. Then another. Then he was moving through the crowd, and several people stepped aside to let him go, and Tackett nodded at his deputy who followed. Crow did not move. He stood on the steps of the county building in his good gray suit and looked at the crowd, at the faces of people he had operated among for 15 years. People who had feared him and deferred to him and sold him their silence piece by piece. And he looked at Mabel Hart, standing in a pale blue dress, holding his own letter in her hand. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wasn't already answered. Tackett put his hand on Crow's arm, not roughly, and walked him down the steps. Briggs looked at his auction papers, and then at the crowd, and then at the retreating figures of Crow and Tackett. And he said to no one in particular, I believe we'll reschedule. The crowd didn't disperse. That was the thing Mabel hadn't anticipated. Not the outcome, not the way Crow went quietly, but the fact that afterward, nobody left. People stood in clusters and talked in the low, urgent voices of people processing something that had shifted the ground under their feet, and one by one several of them came to find Mabel. Tom Greer shook her hand. He was not a man who shook women's hands as a rule, and he did it with the self-conscious deliberateness of someone making a point with the gesture. That took nerve, he said. It took evidence, she said. Nerve is easier when you have evidence. Henderson appeared at her elbow. He looked like a man who had slept badly for 4 years, and was only now beginning to understand that the insomnia might end. The original note, he said quietly. Your father's. I can confirm the county copy was filed as an amendment approximately 6 weeks after your father signed the original. I can put that in writing. I'll need that in writing, Mabel said. You'll have it, he said. He looked at her for a moment. Your father came to me when he was sick. He asked me if there was anything I could do. I told him it was above my authority. I've thought about that a great many times. Mabel looked at him. She thought about what it cost him to say that. She thought about her father sick and alone, and still trying to do the right thing, carrying to a clerk who was also afraid. You did what you could today, she said. That's what matters now. Henderson nodded once precisely and walked away. Elias was at her side when she turned. He'd been giving her space through all of it. She'd been aware of him the whole time, had known exactly where he was in the crowd. The way you know where a fixed point is without having to look at it. And now he was simply there, which was what she'd needed without having known she needed it. It's not over, he said. The federal case takes time. Crow has lawyers who will slow it down. I know, she said. Your cabin. The eviction notice is still technically. I know, she said again. One thing at a time. Samuel appeared through the crowd and came to stand beside his father. He looked at Mabel with those serious dark eyes and said, Did it work? Most of it, Mabel said. The rest takes longer. He considered this. Pa says most things worth doing take longer. Your father is right about that, she said. Samuel looked at Elias. Can we get something to eat? I've been holding the horses for a long time. Something unwound in Mabel's chest. The last tight thing, the one she'd been carrying since 4 in the morning when she'd gotten up to press her dress and go over the documents one final time, and she laughed. It came out real and unguarded and surprised her by the sound of it, and she felt Elias Walker look at her when she laughed with an attention she chose for right now to let simply exist without analysis. Yes, she said to Samuel. We can absolutely get something to eat. Joe. The federal case took 11 weeks. Mabel knew this because she was present for most of it. Not in Denver, but through the letters that moved between Elias and his lawyer with increasing frequency as the circuit court worked through the documents and the testimony and the growing evidence that Silas Crow's operation in Dry Creek had been affecting county records for over a decade. Henderson's written testimony. The comparison of territorial originals against county copies. Tom Greer's resurvey records. The Widow Marsh's receipt book. The document numbers Mabel had memorized in the records office on a Tuesday morning while a nervous clerk was in the back room. Crow's lawyers were good. They were expensive and experienced, and they filed delays and motions and raised procedural questions with the focused creativity of men paid very well to do exactly that. The case did not move fast. It moved the way justice moved in Mabel's experience, which was slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable friction. Because justice was not a clean mechanism, but a human one, built and operated by people who were also afraid, and also had mortgages, and also calculated costs. But it moved. The injunction on the water rights came through in week 3, which meant Crow could not seize the Walker Spring while the case was pending. Elias reopened the spring to the 3 neighboring ranches that had been struggling through the drought, which cost him nothing practical, and earned him the kind of goodwill that doesn't show up in legal documents, but matters enormously in the daily reality of being a person in a community. The Hart Cabin eviction was suspended in week 5, when Mabel's father's original note was formally introduced as evidence, and the $14 figure was confirmed against the territorial records. Crow's claim of $260 was designated fraudulent pending final ruling. Mabel moved back into the cabin briefly to retrieve the rest of her father's things, and to let Widow Marsh, who had been keeping watch over it like a one-woman garrison, know that the situation had changed, the widow cried. Mabel held her hand and let her. The final ruling came at the beginning of October, when the summer had turned, and the heat had broken, and the cottonwood trees along the dry creek had gone gold. The Walker water rights were confirmed in full consistent with the 1847 original registration. The fraudulent amendments were voided. Silas Crow was found liable for land fraud across 9 separate documented cases in Dry Creek County, and the question of criminal prosecution was referred to the federal marshal's office, which was a different proceeding and would take longer and might go in directions no one could fully predict because the law was a human mechanism and Crow still had money and money was not nothing. But the ranch was Elias Walker's, clear and legal and witnessed, and the debt that had followed Mabel Hart since the morning after her father's funeral was gone. Elias told her on the porch. He came back from town with a telegram, and he read it, and then he came and found her. She was in the kitchen garden, the one she'd been rehabilitating since midsummer, her hands in the dirt, and he stood at the garden fence and waited until she looked up. He held out the telegram without a word. She read it standing there with soil on her hands and the late afternoon light coming level and gold across everything, and she read it twice the way she read everything twice. And when she was done, she folded it very carefully along its original creases and handed it back. She did not say anything for a moment. She was doing something internal that required all of her attention, and that she would not have wanted an audience for, except that Elias Walker was not an audience. He was just there. The way the fence was there, and the cottonwood was there, the kind of present that didn't demand anything. "It's over," she said finally. "The fraud case is," he said. "The criminal referral takes—" "I know," she said. "But the part that was ours, that part is over," he nodded. She pulled off her work gloves and held them in her hands and looked at the garden. 12 weeks ago, it had been a patch of dry, cracked ground. Now there were rows, actual productive rows, green things in the ground that would come back next year and the year after, things with roots. "I'll need to think about the cabin," she said. "Yes," Elias said. "There are repairs. The east fence. The kitchen floor has 2 bad boards." "I know a man who does floors," Elias said. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. She had been going to say something careful and measured and appropriately uncertain. She had prepared several versions of careful and measured, had been composing them for approximately 6 weeks, revising them in the early morning, the same way she revised accounts, looking for errors, checking figures, making sure the numbers were honest. She threw all of them out. "I don't want to go back to the cabin," she said. He was very still. "I want to stay here," she said. "On this ranch. Not as a hired hand and not as charity and not as—" She stopped. "I want to stay because this is the first place in my adult life where what I did mattered exactly as much as I did it, and no more and no less. Where nobody made me smaller than I was, and nobody made me something I wasn't." She looked at him steadily. "And because Samuel told me last week that he doesn't want me to leave, and he said it the way you say things when you mean them, and you're not quite sure you should, and I am not going to pretend I don't know what that costs a child who has been losing things his whole life." Elias Walker looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the garden gate and came inside it, which was such a simple thing, and he took her hands, soil and all work roughened exactly as they were, and he held them, and he said, "I was going to ask you properly. I had something prepared." "How long have you had something prepared?" she said. 6 weeks, he said. "Since the records office." "Since the well," he said. "When you held that rope for 40 minutes and never once let go." She looked at their hands. His were as rough as hers. The hands of a man who had been fighting to keep something real for 10 years alone and had nearly lost it, and had not given up. The hands of a man who fixed broken rain barrels before breakfast and crouched in front of his grieving son in the dark of a barn to say the thing that needed saying. "Ask me properly then," she said. He did. She said yes before he finished the sentence, which she thought was probably undignified, but which she found she was entirely at peace with, because she had spent enough of her life performing composure that she knew the difference between composure that protected you and composure that just kept you lonely. Samuel came around the corner of the house. At that exact moment, she would later suspect it was not accidental that he had been listening for the sound of something conclusive and stopped at the garden gate. He looked at his father's face. He looked at Mabel's face. "Good," he said with the simplicity of a child who has known the right answer for weeks and has been waiting for the adults to catch up. They married in late October, when the cottonwoods were fully gold, and the heat was gone, and the valley had that clean, specific smell of high country autumn that Mabel had never been able to name, but had always loved. It was a small ceremony. The widow Marsh came. Henderson came, which surprised Mabel and moved her considerably. Tom Greer and his wife came. Pete Gruber's mother brought pie. The preacher who came out from town was a practical man who said the necessary words without embellishment, which suited both Mabel and Elias perfectly. Samuel stood beside his father and held the ring with the gravity of someone entrusted with an important responsibility, which he was. And when the moment came, he placed it in Elias's hand without dropping it, and looked so privately pleased with himself that Mabel had to hold very still to keep from laughing during the vows. When it was done, and the small group of people around them made the sounds that people make when something good has been made official, Elias put his hand over Mabel's, and they stood in the gold light of the October afternoon, and she felt for the first time in years, possibly for the first time in her adult life, that the arithmetic of her situation had finally come out right. Not easy, not without cost, not without the long specific work of people who refused to accept the numbers as they'd been handed to them and went looking for the originals instead. But right. By the following spring, the Walker Ranch was running at full capacity for the first time in 15 years. The well was properly cleared and reinforced. The feed shed had a solid back wall. The kitchen garden had come back exactly as Mabel had trusted it would. 3 neighboring ranches were watering their stock from the Walker Spring, and 2 of them had sent their sons to help with the summer fencing in a form of payment that didn't require money and didn't need a ledger. Samuel turned 8 in March and asked for a book about beetles, which Mabel found in a catalog and ordered from Denver, and which he received with an expression of pure, unguarded joy that she kept in a specific place in her memory and returned to often. Mabel kept accounts. She was very good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference was that now the numbers she was keeping were for something that was hers, that was theirs, and the arithmetic of it tallied up every morning before the coffee was done, came out the same honest way every time. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was as her father had once told her when she was 12 years old, and learning the difference between what a ledger showed and what a life was worth, everything that mattered. The Walker Ranch sat on the mountain in the spring morning, solid and breathing, and full of the sounds of people who had decided to stay. And Mabel Hart Walker stood on the porch with her coffee and looked out at the valley below, where the creek ran clear and the cottonwoods were coming back to leaf, and she did not lower her eyes for anything or anyone. She had found the originals, she had checked the numbers, and every single one of them was true.